Okay, this is Mrs. Caltagirone, and today we're going to be talking about the second half of our notes on the 1970s. I'm at home recording, so if you hear some dogs in the background or, life happening, I'll try to keep it to a minimum, but you might hear some noises in the background. This unit is 1970s Conflict and Change. Pay attention to that title. There's a lot of conflict in this decade. We've already talked about the problems and the conflict of Watergate that Richard Nixon had. There's a lot of changes. Today, we're going to talk about part 2 of our notes, Presidents Ford and Carter. All right. And this is going to cover the years 1974 to 1981. Right? Gerald Ford becomes president of the United States in 1974 when Nixon resigns. He was the only president who was appointed and not elected. So if you remember the Watergate scandal, we talked about that in our last notes when Richard Nixon, there were some CIA operatives that broke into the Watergate Plaza and where the Democratic headquarters were, and they tried to steal secrets regarding the 1972 election. And Nixon was caught trying to cover that up. It was revealed that he had tapes of all of his conversations in the Oval Office. If you don't know, the Oval Office is where the president's official office is in the White House. And he had a recording system set up there, and his conversations were recorded, and it was revealed that he was offering money to silence the people who had broke into the Watergate Plaza. So when this came out, and of course it appeared that he had broken laws, he resigned in order to avoid being impeached. So when he resigned, his vice president, Gerald Ford, became the president. Now, later we'll talk about the election of 1976, and Gerald Ford ran during that election, but he did not win. So he's the only president in American history who was never elected as president. He wasn't voted on as president or even vice president. If you remember, Spiro Agnew had to resign as vice president. Now, Gerald Ford was not elected, didn't go through the 1972 election, and he was not elected president in 1976. So he served as president for about 2 years, but he was never elected. One of his first acts as president was to pardon Richard Nixon. This greatly angered many Americans. He had a very famous quote. It said, "America's long nightmare has ended." And what he said about that was, we need to put Watergate behind us. We've got a lot to take care of, a lot to deal with. And if we continue trying to go after Richard Nixon, then we're not going to move on. And he pardoned Richard Nixon. And this made many people very angry. And it's probably the reason that he was not reelected was not elected in 1976. That and the economy. So Richard Nixon never faced any criminal court or any discipline or punishment for the Watergate scandal. All right. Ford faced the problem of stagflation, and that was partially created by the rise of oil prices. Stagflation is when inflation is when prices are rising, meets stagnation, which is a sluggish economy. And next year, when you take economics, you'll study more about stagflation. But there's a nice little chart right here. So instead of the economy growing, it's actually declining. But at the same time, inflation is rising. That leads to stagflation. And here's one of the reasons for this. The OPEC, or Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC, was formed in 1960. And if you look at this map here where my cursor is, it's these countries here in the Middle East. They and some in Africa formed OPEC. That's the largest oil producing countries in the world. And in 1973, OPEC imposed an oil embargo on the United States and Western Europe for supporting Israel in the 1973 war. We don't have time to get into all of the reasons for that, but if you look here, Israel is a tiny little country right in here, and a very tiny little country, and most of Western Europe and the United States supported Israel in a war against some the Arabic countries, and I'm sorry, I had to pause for just a moment there. And OPEC was not happy with that, and they called an oil embargo. So they were not selling oil to these countries. And that caused oil prices to skyrocket. And it had a significant impact on the US economy. Prices of food, gasoline, electricity, and heat increased all across the nation. Oil is not only used for transportation and for heating of houses, but the production of plastics and all kinds of things. And so when the countries could not get all the oil they needed, then of course, law of economics, the prices rose, right? Ford continued Nixon's détente policy with the Soviet Union. Okay, so this is going on to another event here, or another portion of his presidency. Remember, we said that détente means a relaxing or an easing of tensions. He said, let's stop trying to build up weapons and having the arms race. Let's continue a time of peace. This led to the Helsinki Accords, where the United States, Canada, and most of Europe recognized post-World War II borders, and they agreed to respect human rights in all of these countries. All right, there was the election, 1976 election. Jimmy Carter campaigned, and he was elected on a promise to clean up Washington, D.C. And he said, we've got the Watergate scandal, we've got all of these problems going on in Washington, and we're going to clean it up. And he wanted to set a moral example to other nations. Jimmy Carter was very strong Christian. He talked about his Christian faith in his campaign all the time. And he said, as a Christian nation, America should be an example. We should not be using, the CIA to do our dirty work, and we need to be an example. If you look at this election map here, most of the West and the Midwest were voted for Ford, for the Republican. The blue, this is mostly in the East, is Jimmy Carter for the Democrats. Jimmy Carter was from Georgia. He had actually been a peanut farmer, and then he ran for governor and had been governor of Georgia before he became president, right? Domestic policy, Carter's domestic policy. Remember, every president has two policies: domestic policy, which is all of the laws and the dealings that take place inside of our country. Foreign policy is all of the relationships and the treaties that we have with other countries. Okay. He created the Department of Energy to deal with the energy crisis that was caused by the oil embargo. The U.S. began to create a strategic oil reserve in case of a national emergency. They put a tax on large cars because the bigger the vehicle, the more gas, the more oil they're going to use. So they began to tax the sale of larger cars. And he dealt with stagflation by cutting federal spending. Now, as I told you in an earlier lesson, I was born during this time. I remember this era. I'm kind of a primary resource to this time period. And I can remember President Carter speaking to Americans and asking us to reserve our energy, to only drive, where we absolutely have to. He asked us to wear a sweater in our house and turn our heat down low so we wouldn't burn as much oil. I can remember long lines of cars lining up to get gas. And sometimes you might sit in your car for almost an hour to pull up to a gas tank or to a gas station to the outlet there where you buy your gas, because there were long lines. In some of the documentaries that you will see, you'll notice that. Okay. All right. He also established the Community Reinvestment Act, which required banks to make credit available to poor communities. And he wanted to prevent the decay of low-income neighborhoods. Okay. And so he said, he looked around at some of the urban areas, and things were falling apart. There were very poor conditions. And so the Community Reinvestment Act was funds that were available for low interest loans to companies and to go into maybe to build grocery stores in low income neighborhoods, and to help people build homes in neighborhoods where they normally it was just decaying. Right? Carter's foreign policy. Okay. Carter signed the Panama Canal Treaty, which returned the canal zone, except for the canal, over to Panama. If you remember way back, if we were face-to-face in class and we were having this lesson, we would talk. I would have you go back and look through your notes. And if you remember way back in the early part of the year when we talked about President Roosevelt, not Franklin Roosevelt, but Theodore Roosevelt and the Panama Canal. And we had a treaty with them, or that we would control that whole area. And it was supposed to be under United States control until 1999. But Carter signed a treaty that allowed the canal zone, the area around the canal, to go back to Panama early. And by the end of the century, Panama had total control over the canal and the canal zone. Right? After the Holocaust, now if you go back to World War II, and we talked about the Holocaust and Hitler's attempts to annihilate the Jews. After that, and after World War II, Israel had been the homeland of the Jews since 1948. There was a mass migration of Jews left Europe and went to Israel, and the nation of Israel was established as a homeland for the Jews in 1948. Well, the United States policy had traditionally been very supportive of Israel in the form of economic and military aid. The United States, since the very beginning, had always supported Israel. If you remember that in just a few moments ago, we talked about the OPEC oil embargo. The OPEC nations were not supportive of Israel, considered Israel an enemy, and they were very resentful that the United States did support Israel. Well, in 1977, Carter invited Anwar Sadat, who was the Prime Minister of Egypt, and Menachem Begin, who was the Prime Minister of Israel, to Camp David for peace talks. Now, Camp David is an area where the president, sometimes they go there on the weekend. It was established for like a presidential retreat. And many times presidents, since Camp David was built, presidents have had foreign leaders to come there, and it's a little bit more of a relaxed atmosphere. Well, Anwar Sadat, who was the Prime Minister of Egypt, and Menachem Begin of Israel did not get along, and those two countries had been at war. They were estranged. They didn't want anything to do with each other. But Carter negotiated peace accords. So under the Camp David Accords, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. And if you look here on the map, the Sinai Peninsula, Israel returned it to Egypt, and Egypt offers a peace treaty and normal diplomatic relations with Israel. And to this day, this peace treaty exists, and Israel and Egypt have friendly relations with each other. They have treaties with each other, and they work together. Right? This is the Sinai Peninsula here, which Israel had control of, and they returned that area back to Egypt. Okay. All right. Carter initially continued Nixon's policy of détente, but then something happened and the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and U.S.-Soviet relations deteriorated. Now, if you know anything about our modern history, we've been involved in Afghanistan since 2001, since the 9/11 attacks. But during this time, the Soviet Union, remember, we were still involved in the Cold War, and the Soviet Union attacked Afghanistan because they wanted access to the oil and to the resources that Afghanistan had. We felt like that was an invasion of a free country, or not a free country, but an independent country. And so, because that happened, the relationship with the Soviet Union fell apart. We halted grain sales to the USSR, and we boycotted the 1980 Olympics. And we postponed SALT II. Remember SALT? We talked about this yesterday or in the previous notes. SALT is the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. It was due to be renewed about 1979 or 1980, and Carter postponed it. Also, he said because of this, the Olympics were supposed to be in Russia in 1980, and he said the United States is going to boycott the Olympics. We're not sending our athletes there. That was a terrible disappointment to many U.S. athletes. But Carter said, first of all, he said we need to make a statement. And second of all, he said we're afraid that our athletes will not be safe there. All right. This is the biggest event of Carter's presidency, and probably the reason that he was not reelected. Is the Iran hostage crisis. This is a very important time period. It began with the overthrow of the Shah of Iran and his relocation to the United States. Now, the Shah was the leader of Iran, and he was not a religious leader. He was, I'm sorry, the word I'm looking for is secular. He was a secular leader of Iran. And the young students there, and he lived very opulently, very richly. And you'll see when you watch the video that I have and the Edpuzzle that I have, there'll be an introduction about his way of life and the way the average person lived in Iran. And he was overthrown by a group of militants. Many of them were young students, and they wanted a religious leader to lead them. And so the Iranian students, they were following a man named Ayatollah Khomeini. Okay, and they seized the U.S. embassy in Iran, and they held the staff there hostage for 444 days. So Carter was president, and so that if you know how many days are in a year, 365. So they held the hostages there for over a year. And throughout this whole time, Carter was trying to get the hostages back, and one effort after another failed. All right. And the U.S. imposed sanctions, and they launched a failed rescue attempt, and that ended terribly. Ended in the helicopters crashed, and American military men died. And we lost face, and we lost image and credibility across the world. And it made America look very weak. That, you've got these people over there being held hostage, and you cannot negotiate. You can't rescue them, through your CIA ops. And it made America look very weak and embarrassed. And Carter really kind of admitted he was at his wit's end. He didn't know how he was going to get the Americans back. The reason that the people were held hostage is because the Shah, when he was ousted, he was suffering from cancer. He was dying from cancer, but he came here to the United States for a sanctuary and to be treated for cancer. And that made the students and the radicals very angry. and they were demanding that the United States return the Shah to them to stand trial for his crimes. And the United States would not do that, and so that was their demands for holding the hostages for so long. Okay. We launched a failed rescue attempt, but the inability to free the hostages damaged the U.S. and the credibility across the world. And during this time, and we'll talk about President Reagan in our next unit in just a few days, but just as Reagan was being sworn into office, he ran against Carter. Just as he was being sworn into office, the hostages were released in Iran. So the hostages were released on Jimmy Carter's last day in office. All right, and that will end our notes for the Ford and Carter presidency. Please be sure that you watch the Edpuzzles. They have a lot of very interesting information. The Edpuzzle on the Iran hostage crisis is actually the introduction to the movie Argo, which won an Academy Award for Best Picture, I believe, around 2014. I think you'll enjoy that. So be sure that you watch that. All right, and complete all of your assignments and let me know if you have any questions or comments.